DY1UR0, the klaxons started at 0347 ship, time their wailing cutting through the silence of night, cycle like a knife through flesh, and I jolted awake in my quarters with my heart already racing because no one who serves aboard an Imperial Navy vessel for 15 years mistakes those particular alarms for anything but catastrophe. I was navigator, Tertius aboard the faithful Endeavour, a dictator, class cruiser 3 centuries old and showing every year of it, in creaking bulkheads and temperamental systems that required constant prayer and maintenance. And I'd guided us through the warp, routes of the Gold Stars sector for the past decade without major incident. That record ended the moment those klaxons began their scream. I threw on my uniform without bothering with proper protocol. No time for the 17 buttons and 3 ceremonial sashes that marked my rank, and ran toward the bridge through corridors, suddenly filled with rushing crew, and the smell of burning ozone that meant weapons were being charged. Shields were being raised. Something had gone catastrophically wrong with our planned patrol route through a supposedly cleared system. The bridge was chaos when I arrived, officers shouting over one another, while servitors chittered binary panic at their monitoring stations, and the massive viewport showed something that made my enhanced navigator's third eye, the one I kept carefully bandaged beneath the white cloth wrapped around my forehead, twitch with phantom pain. Ships, dozens of them, no hundreds, filling the void around us like a swarm of insects, all mismatched sizes and configurations, some clearly built from scratch while others were recognizably Imperial or Xenos vessels that had been so heavily modified they'd become something else entirely, something wrong, something that violated every principle of naval architecture and void warfare doctrine I'd ever studied. They were crude, asymmetrical, covered in jagged protrusions and garish paint in reds and yellows and checkerboard patterns that hurt to look at. Ork vessels. We'd translated from the warp directly into the middle of a massive Ork fleet. Thousands of greenskins piloting warships that shouldn't fly but somehow did through sheer bloody-minded belief that they could. Captain Andrast was at her command throne, her aged face grim as she received reports from every section of the ship, all of them bad. Shields at 60% and failing. Those impacts are from ramming attempts. They're literally throwing smaller ships at us like projectiles. Weapons batteries responding, but ammunition reserves critical after that last engagement. Engines nominal but were boxed in, no clear vector for warp translation. Navigator, I need options and I need them 5 minutes ago. I moved to my navigation station, interfaced with the ship's sensors, tried to calculate a safe route through the swarm that wouldn't result in our immediate destruction or worse, a mistimed warp jump that would scatter us across the immaterium. The numbers were bad. The void around us was so dense with vessels and debris and electromagnetic interference from crude Ork technology that finding safe passage would require luck we didn't have. I told the captain this, watched her jaw tighten, watched her make the calculation every commander dreads. We couldn't fight free. We couldn't run. Which meant we could only endure and hope the Emperor provided deliverance before the greenskins decided to finish us. The boarding began at hour 2. They didn't use sophisticated boarding torpedoes or teleportarium technology. They simply rammed crude vessels into our hull at points where our shields had collapsed, then cut through the armor plating with what sounded like oversized chainsaws and flooded into our corridors in waves of screaming green muscle and rusted blades. The Vox network filled with combat reports, with desperate calls for reinforcement, with the sounds of close quarters battle as our security teams tried to repel boarders at dozens of breach points simultaneously. We were losing. Not quickly, not easily. Imperial Navy armsmen are trained and disciplined and well equipped, but steadily, inevitably, as sheer numbers overwhelmed defensive positions and the Orks pushed deeper into the ship's critical systems. Engineering fell at hour 3. Medical at hour 4. By hour 5 they'd reached the crew quarters and were herding captured personnel toward the cargo holds, and I could hear through the Vox the laughter. That terrible guttural laughter that Orks make when they're enjoying violence, when they're having what they consider a good time. The bridge held until hour 7 when something massive, I never saw what exactly, just heard the tremendous impact and felt the deck lurch beneath us, breached the primary bulkhead, and a dozen orcs poured through the gap into our command center. They were enormous, each easily twice the height of a human and broader than any 3 men, their skin the color of diseased vegetation, their jaws filled with tusks that would shame a wild boar. They wore armor that looked like it had been assembled from scrap metal, and faith in their own invincibility, carried weapons that were oversized and crude, but devastatingly effective when applied with orcish strength. They killed the first officer who raised his weapon, just grabbed him and tore him literally in half with a sound like wet fabric ripping, and the rest of us understood immediately that resistance would be suicide. Captain Andraste ordered stand down, ordered surrender, chose to save what crew she could rather than die pointlessly defending a ship that was already lost. The orcs laughed at this, seemed to find our surrender hilarious, and the largest one, a creature wearing what might have been a naval officer's coat torn and modified to fit its massive frame, approached the captain and said in broken Gothic, "You da boss. Good boss, stay alive, make ship work, make ship go fast. We go crumpen." Then it turned to survey the rest of us with small red eyes that held a terrible intelligence hidden beneath the brutish exterior. "You lot. Fix ship, make better, or we eat you. Simple, yeah." They herded us to the cargo holds where the rest of the surviving crew had been gathered. I counted maybe 400 out of our original complement of 1,200, which meant 800 dead or dying in the corridors and compartments where the boarding action had raged. We were sorted with ruthless efficiency, technical staff and officers in one group, general crew in another, injured and elderly in a third. I watched as they dragged the third group away and heard the sounds that followed. The screaming that cut off abruptly, the satisfied grunting of orcs feeding. They were eating the wounded, just casually consuming human flesh like it was rations, like we were livestock they'd captured rather than sentient beings who deserved mercy or at least quick death. I watched this happen and felt something break inside me, some fundamental assumption about the universe that said even enemies followed certain rules, maintained certain standards. Orcs didn't have standards. Orcs had appetite and pragmatism, and an absolute lack of concern for anything except their own entertainment and survival. The technical staff were split further, engineers in one group, weapons specialists in another, me and the 3 other navigators in our own small cluster, because we were valuable, we were rare. We were the only ones aboard who could guide a ship through the warp, and that made us too useful to eat immediately. The largest orc, I learned later his name was Captain Grimscar, and he led this particular fleet of looters and pirates, approached our group and studied us with that disturbing intelligence. "You lot, you see da ways, yeah, you see da weird place what makes ships go fast." His Gothic was terrible but comprehensible, and I realized with sick certainty that he'd captured enough Imperial vessels to have learned our language, to understand our technology at least superficially. One of the other navigators, a young woman named Cestia, who'd only served 5 years, started crying. Grimscar laughed and reached out with a massive hand to pat her head like she was a pet. "Don't cry, little seer. You gonna help us good. Make us rich. Make us fast. You do good, you live long time. You do bad." He made a gesture across his throat. "We got other seers. Always need seers, but don't need all seers. Understand? DAY2OR24. They put us to work immediately, no rest, no pause to grieve or process what had happened. The orcs didn't understand exhaustion the way humans did. They could fight and work for days without sleep, powered by some Xenos physiology that made them functionally tireless, and they expected the same from us. My assignment was simple: help them understand the faithful Endeavor's navigation systems so they could integrate it into their fleet, so they could use our warp capable vessel to raid deeper into Imperial space than their crude ships could normally penetrate. I was taken to what had been the navigation chamber, that sacred space where I'd spent thousands of hours plotting courses through the Immaterium, and found it already half destroyed. The orcs had been investigating the equipment, which meant they'd torn open panels and pulled out components and generally trashed decades of careful maintenance in their enthusiasm to understand how things worked. Servitors that had once assisted my calculations lay in pieces, their biological components exposed and rotting, their mechanical parts scattered across the deck. The observation dome that allowed me to see into the warp during translation was cracked, its sacred seals broken, its purity compromised in ways that would require years of Mechanicus blessing to repair, if repair was even possible. A smaller orc, still massive by human standards but perhaps only 1.5 times my height, was waiting for me, introduced himself as Mechboy Razgit, and explained with disturbing enthusiasm that he was going to learn everything about the navigation systems. You teach, I learn, we make ship better, we make ship bigger, we add more guns, we add more engines, we make ship proper Orky. He said this like it was good news, like I should be excited about the prospect of watching Imperial technology be corrupted into whatever insane amalgamation Orks considered improved design. I tried to explain that navigation systems were delicate, that they required precise calibration, that you couldn't just add random components and expect them to function. Razgit found this hilarious. Everything works if you believe hard enough, Seer, you believe too small. We're gonna teach you believe big. Then he pointed at a panel he'd removed that contained critical warp field generators and asked me to explain what each component did and how they could make it more better. The next 8 hours were a nightmare of technical translation and watching in horror as Razgit interpreted my explanations in ways that violated every principle of naval engineering. I'd explain how a warp field stabilizer maintained consistent field integrity during immaterium translation, and he'd nod enthusiastically and immediately start connecting it to completely unrelated systems, adding wires that sparked and components that clearly came from different ship classes or possibly different Xenos technologies entirely. When I protested that his modifications would cause catastrophic failure, he'd just laugh and say, maybe, maybe not. Only one way, find out, and continue his work. The terrifying thing was that somehow impossibly, his modifications seemed to function. Systems that should have exploded or failed instead operated. Not well, not efficiently, but they operated. Held together by orcish belief, and what I was beginning to suspect was actual reality. Warping psychic field that allowed their technology to work through sheer, collective faith. That it would. I saw other technical staff during meal breaks. The orcs fed us, at least, though the food was terrible. Some kind of fungal protein that tasted like moldy bread and made your stomach cramp, and everyone reported similar experiences. The engineers were watching in horror as Orks improved the plasma drives by simply adding more fuel injectors without proper containment fields. The weapons specialists were being forced to help install captured Imperial armaments alongside crude Orkish guns in combinations that should tear the ship apart from recoil stress. The Medica staff were being made to explain human biology to Orks who found the information fascinating and immediately started discussing how they could modify themselves to be more choppy or more shooty. Captain Andrast was being kept separate, held in what had been her own quarters, forced to provide command codes and authorization protocols so the Orks could access secured systems. She looked 20 years older when I saw her briefly during a corridor transit, her uniform torn and filthy, her eyes hollow with the knowledge of what was being done to her ship. DAY-FEHUR 120, the transformation was accelerating. The ship changing around us hour by hour as hundreds of Orks swarmed through every section simultaneously, all of them improving things according to their own demented logic. Walls were being torn down to create larger spaces. Orks preferred open areas where they could see potential enemies and allies alike. New walls were being welded in place made from scavenged armor, plating and scrap metal, all of it painted in that garish red and yellow scheme that seemed to be this fleet's colors. Sections of the ship that had been crew quarters were converted into crude barracks where Orks slept in piles like animals. The chapel where we'd held daily devotions was gutted and turned into some kind of trophy room filled with skulls and weapons and pieces of destroyed enemy vessels. They'd torn down the Aquila symbols, the icons of the Emperor, replaced them with crude glyphs that I think represented their gods, Gork and Mork, violence and cunning personified. The smell was unbearable. Orks didn't maintain hygiene the way humans did, didn't use proper sanitation, just lived in their own filth and seemed not to notice or care. The ship that had once smelled like recycled air and machine oil now reeked of unwashed bodies and spoiled meat, and something fungal that made your eyes water. I tried breathing through my mouth, but that just meant I could taste it, that distinctive flavor of decay and alien biology that coated your tongue and made eating nearly impossible. The other human crew were suffering worse. Many had developed respiratory infections, skin rashes from constant contact with contaminated surfaces, digestive problems from the awful food. The Orks found our suffering amusing, would laugh when someone vomited or collapsed, would make jokes in their brutal language that sent them into fits of guttural mirth. I was spending 12, sometimes 16 hours a day working with WAAAGH in the navigation chamber, forced to watch as he systematically destroyed and improved systems that had taken centuries to develop. He'd added what he called a warp booster to the translation engines. It was literally just 3 extra power generators wired directly into the warp field matrix with no safety overrides or regulatory systems. When I protested that engaging this modification would probably tear the ship apart or scatter us across multiple dimensions simultaneously, he just grinned and said, "Probably. But if it work, we go real fast. Worth risk, yeah." This was Orkish logic distilled to its purest form. Any risk was acceptable if the potential reward was sufficiently entertaining. Safety was cowardice. Caution was boring. Better to die spectacularly than live carefully. The worst part was that I was beginning to understand their technology, beginning to see the twisted logic that made it function despite violating every known principle of physics and engineering. Orks believed things worked, and that belief generated a psychic field that made reality conform to their expectations. It wasn't consistent, didn't work if you tried to weaponize it deliberately, didn't function for individuals, only manifested when large numbers of Orks collectively believed something. But it was real, measurably real, created actual physical effects that could be detected and studied. I was watching superstition become science, watching faith literally reshape matter, and it was breaking my understanding of how the universe functioned. If Orkish technology worked through belief, what did that say about Imperial technology? Did our ships fly because they were properly engineered, or because we believed they were properly engineered? Did prayer to the machine, God actually bless equipment? Or did billions of tech, priests believing prayer worked create enough psychic resonance to make it true? These were heretical thoughts, dangerous questions, the kind that got you investigated by the Inquisition. But alone in that navigation chamber, with only an Ork mech boy for company, I couldn't stop thinking them. WAAAGH 240, the modifications were complete enough that Grimskar decided to test the ship's new capabilities, which meant taking us out of the relatively safe asteroid field where his fleet had been lurking and heading toward actual prey. The target was an Imperial supply convoy, 3 transport vessels with minimal escort, carrying food and ammunition to a garrison world on the sector's edge. We translated from the warp using my calculations, my coordinates, my knowledge of the secret routes through the immaterium that only navigators could perceive, and I felt my soul stain with the betrayal. I was helping Orks attack Imperial vessels. I was enabling Xenos pirates. I was committing treason of the highest order, and the alternative was being eaten, was watching my crewmates be tortured and killed, was choosing death over dishonor. I chose dishonor. I chose survival. I provided the coordinates that brought us into real space behind the convoy's defensive formation, that gave the Orks perfect positioning for their attack. The battle was brief and brutal. The faithful Endeavor, now painted in red and yellow, now covered in crude glyphs and trophies, now so modified it barely resembled an Imperial vessel, surged forward at speeds that should have torn it apart. WAAAGH's improvements, somehow functioning despite my certainty they'd fail. We crashed into the convoy like a predator into a flock of birds, our weapons, Imperial lance batteries mixed with Orkish mega, cannons in combinations that hurt to look at, tearing through the transport's shields with devastating efficiency. The escort frigate tried to respond, managed to score several hits on our hull, but the Orks had added so much additional armor in such haphazard fashion that critical systems were accidentally protected by random plates welded over them. We shrugged off damage that should have disabled us, close to boarding range. And I watched through the viewport as Orks launched themselves across the void in small attack craft, saw them swarm over the escort's hull like insects, saw them breach and board and overwhelm the defenders in minutes. The transports surrendered immediately, their captains choosing to save their crews rather than fight a battle they couldn't win. I watched as Orks herded Imperial personnel into cargo holds, watched as they sorted the captives exactly as they'd sorted us, technical staff separated, general crew gathered, wounded and elderly dragged away to feed the fleet. 3 more ships' worth of humans absorbed into this nightmare, hundreds more souls damned to serve Xeno's masters until they died or lost their minds, or were finally eaten when their usefulness expired. The Orks were celebrating, firing weapons into the void in displays of triumph, painting fresh kill markers onto the faithful Endeavor's hull, generally having what they considered a wonderful time. Grimskar appeared on the bridge, slapped Captain Andrast on the back with enough force to make her stumble, and declared in his broken Gothic, "Good hunt! Proper ships! You lot make good Orky now! We keep you, yeah, make you part of fleet!" You the first Humies what joined the Grimskar pirates proper. I realized then what was happening, what was going to continue happening. We weren't prisoners waiting for rescue or exchange. We were being assimilated, absorbed into the Ork fleet, forced to serve as the technical and navigational staff that allowed these pirates to function at higher efficiency than normal Orks could achieve. The faithful Endeavor wasn't going to be scrapped or abandoned. It was going to become the fleet's primary raiding vessel, would use its speed and Imperial identification codes to penetrate deep into supposedly safe space, would attack convoys and isolated outposts and smaller vessels that couldn't defend themselves. And I would be guiding it, would be providing the calculations and coordinates that made these raids possible, would be enabling month after month and year after year of predation against my own species, DY-20 HOUR 480. The new crew from the captured convoy had been integrated, distributed throughout the fleet based on their skills, forced to work alongside us maintaining and improving the Orkish vessels. I'd met some of them during brief rest periods, learned their names and stories, learned that the escort frigate's navigator, a man named Peleus, who'd served for 20 years, had committed suicide rather than be forced to serve the Orks, had somehow managed to blind his third eye with a piece of sharpened metal while his guards were distracted, had bled out before anyone found him. Part of me envied his courage, his refusal to compromise, his choice of death over collaboration. The larger part of me was grateful for my own cowardice, my willingness to do anything to survive, my ability to rationalize betrayal as necessary pragmatism. The Orks were planning something bigger now, something that required multiple ships working in coordination, something that made even Grimskar seem excited in a way that suggested this would be spectacular violence, even by Ork standards. They'd captured intelligence during the convoy raid, data, slates and cogitator cores that contained shipping manifests and defensive protocols, and they'd forced our technical staff to decrypt and analyze everything. What they'd found was information about a forge, world in the neighboring system, a minor production facility that manufactured components for Imperial Navy vessels. The world was lightly defended. Most of the sector's military resources were deployed dealing with a different Xenos threat, and the Orks saw this as perfect opportunity for a massive raid. They'd attack the forge, world, loot everything they could carry, capture tech, priests and servitors to help maintain their fleet, and generally cause devastation that would cripple Imperial naval operations in the sector for years. I was required to plot the approach vector, calculate the warp route that would bring the entire fleet into the forge, world's system simultaneously, coordinate the arrival timing so all vessels translated from the immaterium at once rather than piecemeal. It was complex work, the most sophisticated navigation I'd ever attempted, required precision that was difficult enough with proper equipment and nearly impossible with the half-orkified systems I was working with. I spent days on the calculations, triple-checking everything, knowing that mistakes would be catastrophic, but also knowing that success would enable the deaths of thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Imperial citizens. I could sabotage this. I could introduce subtle errors into my calculations, could cause the fleet to translate into a sun, or into solid matter, or simply scatter across the sector, where they'd be vulnerable to Imperial Navy patrols. This would be heroic. This would be the right choice. This would also kill me and every human aboard these vessels immediately when the Orks discovered what I'd done. I chose survival. Again, I provided accurate calculations again. I enabled Xeno's aggression against my own species. Again, and I told myself it wasn't betrayal, told myself I was waiting for opportunity, told myself that staying alive meant eventually I might find a way to escape, to warn the Imperium, to redeem my choices through some future act of heroism. These were lies. I knew they were lies, but lies were all I had left, the only thing protecting my sanity from the reality of what I'd become. DA30 OUR 7-20, the attack on the Forge world was successful beyond even Orks.